Hi, Journeyers. This is Tony Carnes, your host for A Journey Through NYC Religions Television. Lots of political noise lately out of Washington and in our city. In Washington, Trump is doing all of his changes. In our city, the corruption charges against the Mayor Eric Adams, were dismissed. And he announced that he's not going to run as a Democrat, but he's going to run as an independent. Now, he may be counting on a heavy support among the religious of the city, which he got in his last election. This is a trend that's been going on, and it's changing New York, but it's not stopped and hasn't reached its endpoint yet. In 1997, I conducted a survey on the vision of leadership among church leaders here and other religious leaders here in the city. Most of the religious leaders, of course, were concerned by local issues like traffic and garbage collection. However, there were a cosmopolitan 12% that said that their interests were citywide and even nationwide. Pretty soon, they were starting to influence other city religious leaders and their congregations to think that way also. In 2004, this cosmopolitan 12% persuaded a large portion of religious leaders in the city toward supporting the Republican presidential candidate George W. Bush. This shift was striking because most of the leaders would identify themselves as Democrats. One Hispanic American pastor in the Bronx told me a story about he and his father. His father, who was a pastor also, came to the son and said, "Son, I don't want to insult you, but," he whispered, "have you become a Republican?" The son told his father, said, "Yes, I believe this time I'm going the Republican way." With Reverend A.R. Bernard, I did another survey of religious leaders here in the city in 2004 to find out what was going on. Sure enough, a Texas Republican, George W. Bush, was seen as more faith-friendly than the Democrat candidate. A New York Times wrote a story on our survey, said, "For New York evangelicals, a political conversion." This conversion went beyond the evangelicals. Randall Balmer, professor at Barnard College at the time, said that it is a very significant development, though it may take some time to reach its final development. Mayor Michael Bloomberg noticed, and he soon brought back annual gatherings of religious leaders and proclaimed 2010 at an Albanian mosque in Staten Island that, quote, "not 1 inch of the city is off limits to the love of God." What an amazing proclamation by a mayor of New York City. However, the faithful became dissatisfied over time with the rising crime and also the poor state of the schools. So they moved toward Eric Adams in 2021. And they probably provided the edge of victory for him. Adams, as a result, Adams appointed a Caribbean-born pastor named Reverend Guilford Monrose as his faith-based advisor and had put 2 other close advisors who were pastors on his staff. Now, Adams has run into a lot of trouble with these corruption charges and city problems after the pandemic. But he may well be rescued by a strong move toward Trump among the religious in New York City. Almost every religious immigrant group in New York City shifted toward Donald Trump in the 2024 election. Now, this doesn't mean that he won those groups here in the city, but the shift toward Trump was very large. Only the non-religious increased their vote for the Democratic candidate. Last August, Mayor Adams did a faith tour, visiting dozens, maybe hundreds of religious sites as part of his re-election campaign. Undoubtedly, he's planning on getting that support again. We'll see whether the religious are more dissatisfied with some of Adams's problems, or are they more repelled by the progressive candidates, none of whom have mentioned religion as an element of their appeal. In order to sort of sort out this changing political culture of the city, we've asked a prominent Trump supporter among the churches here in the city, Eric Metaxas, to be with us. Welcome to the program, Eric.
When you talk about the immigrant thing, that's where I'm coming from. And
that's right.
It's puzzled me. I've come to terms with this, but it took me time to figure out why I feel the way I do, or why I've turned around on certain things. As you know, I went to Yale University. I live in Manhattan. You know, I'm part of a certain world, but I grew up in Queens among the immigrant community. My dad came from Greece. My mom came from Germany. They met in an English class here in Manhattan. And so I grew up among working class immigrants, which does give me a really dramatically different perspective. And I kind of feel that that can help people make sense of why I would think the way I do on a lot of things. And obviously we're going to talk about my book, If You Can Keep It, but that is, I'm sorry, I keep saying that. My book is called Fish Out of Water, A Search for the Meaning of Life. But it really is about the immigrant experience. I know that's why you introduced things the way you did. But I do think that that's really important, especially for New York. So thanks for bringing that up.
Well, tell us a little bit about that immigrant experience, and what points along do you think led you to eventually supporting Trump?
Well, you know, it's a
that didn't come automatically. You were not an early Trump supporter, but
oh no. Listen, I wrote a piece making fun of Trump. In the New Yorker magazine. So I'm not exactly somebody that was, you know, pro-Trump in the beginning, but I think it's very complicated, especially, you know, for New York audiences. I mean, I have a lot of Jewish people in the building that I live in who are incredibly pro-Trump. And I would have thought, New York Jewish, I wouldn't think that, but they're very pro-Trump. And I think it's important to understand different demographics as you're doing. My story really is that as I said, I grew up as a working class kid with an immigrant background. The reason my book is called Fish Out of Water is because my father's Greek and my mother's German. So I always joke around that if you're raised Greek and German, you will be raised Greek. So my mother, you know, still has a German accent to this day. My father still has a strong Greek accent to this day. But when you put together Greeks and Germans, Greeks, you know, they have this idea that they're just the best ethnic group and there's nothing they can do about it. They're just they'll let you in, you know. So my upbringing was in the Greek Orthodox Church and in the Greek community, first in Corona, Queens, at Transfiguration of Christ Church. I went to the parochial school there. But the reason my book is titled Fish Out of Water is that if your mom is German and you don't speak Greek at home, when you're hanging out in the Greek community in Queens or in many places, everybody speaks Greek at home. Everybody has two Greek parents. They're virtually Greek, except they happen to be here in Queens. And so for me, I always felt like a fish out of water. And obviously I write about that in the book. It's nothing traumatic. It was a wonderful experience of growing up in an immigrant community. And I am, of course, a little bit more Greek, I think, just because I did grow up in that community, in that church environment. But it is so different. When I came to, when we moved to Connecticut, Danbury, Connecticut in 1972, I suddenly thought, wow, I really am an immigrant from New York, because I felt like I had moved to America. It was a completely different environment. It was still a working class environment. It wasn't like Darien or Greenwich or anything, but it really was fascinating to me how steeped I was. And in writing this book, actually, I have become more clear on how very dramatically different growing up in an immigrant New York community was than growing up, you know, someplace in the suburbs where kids ride bikes and stuff. But for us, it was just, you know, It was just different.
And you, as you made this shift, you you sort of were grasping for God along the way. It was almost like he was in and out. You'd like to talk about the experiences that you had that
Yeah. I
thought
mean,
was a
yes. And
divine.
the reason I do that is because I don't think most people are necessarily looking for God. They're just going through life just like I was. I was not, you know, running from God. I was not running toward God. I was just a kid growing up, you know, normal kid. And I think when you grow up in a faith community like the Greek Orthodox Church, you kind of take everything for granted. You just figure, well, if I'm not Jewish, I'm not atheist, I'm not Buddhist, I'm not Muslim, I guess, you know, we're Christians. But we never really got clarity on what is it that we believe. Do we really believe this? Do we really believe what we shout and sing at Easter? Christos anesti ek nekron, thanaton thanaton patisas. It's this incredible thing to say that Jesus rose from the dead. And, you know, and when I got to college, obviously I thought, do I believe this? I have no idea if I believe this. And I actually think that's typical for a lot of people. They're not against things. They're just going through stuff. And so I did have some experiences with God. You know, it wasn't like a secular church experience, but it's just weird. One of the times that I really had, the first time I heard what Christians call the gospel, the good news, I was in a Russian Orthodox church. The Greek Orthodox youth group, the Goya, we'd been sent off to a Russian Orthodox church in Danbury, Connecticut. And the funny thing is, and most of the book is meant to be humorous. I mean, these are a lot of funny stuff. I'm being serious with you here, but it's hilarious to me that the Greeks really only hang out with the Greeks. So the fact that we were sent off to this Russian Orthodox church, I thought, what is going on here? You don't trust us with the Russians. Are you
like
kidding?
Going over the mountain.
Down it was really, really funny to me. And the priest at this Russian Orthodox church was delightful. And he was very humble. He was American, you know.
Pretty young also.
And he was quite young. And he shares the basics of the faith with us in a very clear way. I had never heard it before because, as I said, I think that a lot of times, you know, if you're raised in an ethnic Catholic background or an ethnic Orthodox background, you sort of assume this stuff. You got baptized, you go to church on Sundays, you know, you don't really break it down the way evangelicals do. And so for me, I never heard this stuff before. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. And I agreed with everything. And I, you know, prayed, accept Jesus and all this different stuff. And it was kind of powerful. And from that point on, age 12, I would pray at night, but I never talked to anyone about it. And I never had any discipleship or anybody following up. It was like, that was it. And later on, when I was in high school, I had a friend that I met, you know, working, I was working as a cashier at Marshall's or something. And he was part of this Catholic charismatic community. This was like the Jesus people in the 70s in Danbury, Connecticut. What's that?
Wasn't it called the community?
It was called, yes, the community, right. And it was the sweetest group of people. I just would visit once in a while and they'd be sitting on folding chairs and they'd be praying. Sometimes they'd be praying in tongues, which I'd never heard before. But mostly it was just people praying, praising God. But it was so sweet that even as a 16-year-old, I remember thinking, this is really touching. This seems right. This Jesus stuff, it seems right. And so that kind of encouraged me a little bit, maybe a lot, you know, at the time. But then I went off to college, and in college, same thing. I didn't really talk to anybody about faith. I would sneak off to the Christian group like every Friday night for the, you know, hour and a half or whatever. And then there was just zero follow-up or community or anything like that. And by the time I got to Yale, I really drifted away from it. So that by the time I graduated, I was thoroughly confused. I didn't know what I believed. And it was that was the hard time. That was after college. I was floating and drifting around, and things got so bad that I ended up moving in back with my parents, which if your parents are working class European immigrants, you don't want to go to Yale and then move back home because they're going to think, what is wrong with you? Like we sacrificed unbelievably to send you to college. You get to live in America. We lived in war-torn Europe, communist East Germany. Like what's the problem? it was a hard time, but I mean, I write about this all in the book, and it's obviously, a lot of it is really beautiful because the love that my parents had for me, I see now was the undergirding of my life, that just to give me a sense that I really am loved. And even though they might not have known theologically or intellectually that this is the love of Jesus being passed through us to our son, it doesn't matter that they knew it explicitly. It was the love of God. And it really, that's to me the baseline of my life. It's what kept me going when things got really dark.
You know, Eric, I noticed, and the book is really well written. And I noticed one thing that was interesting. It has sort of, it alters between low culture and high culture. You know, high culture like Yale, low culture like ordinary people, everyday life. When you walk, you give actually more voice to the low culture people. They're and which I don't mean low culture, I mean in this technical sense that the populace, the popular culture, your parents, your relatives, also people you ran across in your workplace, like the painters that you worked with, or the guy down in the village, the relative or distant relative you stayed with. They're memorably etched. You can read them and you'll never forget them. They're so gripping and so sometimes sort of tough, but honest. And you start this sort of low culture richness when you write about your family in Greece and about here. Which one of your relatives, your grandfather or your aunt or your grandmother who your father stayed with, who do you think you etched most perfectly the character who you wrote?
Well, I don't know that I edged anyone perfectly, much less most perfectly. I'm grateful that you think that I've done a good job. I mean, listen, I've been writing my whole life, which now extends many decades. And I got to tell you, writing about oneself is the strangest experience. I mean, it really is the strangest experience because we naturally tell stories about ourselves, right? We say, oh, I was here and here's what happened. I was there and here's what happened. And so I've told stories my whole life very naturally. Um, and you tell them over and over. And when you finally sit down to write them, you realize, well, it really is like a tape recorder. I know exactly how I'm going to tell the story. But it's an interesting thing to finally put it into words and to look at it on the page and to realize other people are going to read this, because there is no doubt there is a lot of love in this book. I mean, I adore my mom and dad, who I thank God I still have with me. And I adore the relatives that I write about in the book. My grandmother was just one of the most extraordinary people I have ever known. And my Uncle
Describe her
Joe.
for us.
Well, my grandmother, she's really tough to describe. You know, she was like barely 5 feet tall, really, really thin and wiry. She was like a kid. She had a ton of energy.
This is your great grandmother.
No. Sorry, this is my mother's mother. My grandmother, my mother's mother, and Gertrude Kregen was her name, but I just knew her as Grandma. Grandma was one of the funniest, most up people I have ever known. She was just full of fun. And, you know, when you think of Germans, you don't typically think of this, but my family, they're from Saxony and Thuringia, you know, the area where Luther was from. And they're kind of, you know, peasant stock, and they're just full of jokes and kidding around, constant kidding around. I thought that was normal growing up, that my mother and my grandmother are constantly kidding around, joking, making fun of people, you know, not in a nasty way, but like just constant. And, you know, I look back on it and I think not many people have a German grandmother who is hilarious. She was really funny, and certainly not in a highbrow way, not in a witty way, but just funny, really funny. And I think that I get my sense of humor to some extent from her. It has to be. But there are, you know, when I think of her, she grew up very poor, lost her father when she was 7. My mother lost her father, who's my grandmother's husband, when she was 10. they really suffered. They went through World War II, obviously lost my grandfather, and my grandmother, had to raise two girls and literally had no food sometimes to give her girls for dinner, nothing.
Your grandfather tried to stay out of the war as long as he could. Is that right?
He was, he was, this is the other thing too, is like a lot of people, life is so complicated. Here he is, a German man living under Hitler, and he was not on board with Hitler. I mean, I wrote my book on Bonhoeffer, which is behind me here. I really was amazed to hear my grandmother tell me the story that my grandfather would listen to the BBC with his ear literally pressed against the radio speaker, because if you were caught listening, this is enemy broadcasts, you'd be sent to a concentration camp. But of course, many Germans were not on board with Hitler and what was happening in the nation. They were frightened. And he tried to stay out of the war, and his friend, or rather, it was a family friend who ran the factory where he worked. He worked in a sewing machine factory in Altenburg, and he was able to keep him working in the factory until 1943, so he didn't have to go off to battle. But eventually, 43, he went, and in 44, he was killed. Train was blown up by partisans on the way to the Russian front. It's one of these horrifying things. And my grandmother, it's so obvious how much she loved my grandfather. It's just so obvious from the stories she would tell about him over the years. And my grandmother really had spiritual experiences. She was not a churchgoer. She was not somebody who read the Bible, but she knew God. She knew Jesus and prayed every morning and every night. And it was very real for her, very real and very simple. And she had a number of experiences with God. So she was not a religious person, and yet she knew God and walked with God. It's really extraordinary to me to think about that, because it didn't mean much to me at the time. But then in retrospect, once I came to faith, I realized that, that's where she got a lot of her inner peace and joy that was so clear in her life, and that she shed abroad in our family at every opportunity. It's really amazing the difference one person can make.
I noticed in your book, A Fish Out of Water, which we'll have a link to on our with our program, that one thing that often moved you close to God, or at least think about God, was music. I didn't realize you were so musically attuned. And yet, over and over again, you respond to sound, music, rhythm, and it brings you to a recognition of God. Tell us, were you conscious of that at the time?
I'm not even conscious of it now until you mentioned it. So now I'm going to ask you, Tony Carnes, what do you mean? Because I'm fascinated that you picked that up. What specifically did you pick up? Because I am very musical, but I'm not at all conscious of having put any of that in the book, or of having any relationship between that and my faith. So now I'm fascinated what you picked up.
Well, let me give a really big example, which is the more subtle examples are, of course, in some ways more important. But let me give a really big example. You decide to sing a cappella. Was it Amazing Grace?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's only 9 years ago. President Obama and the Senate leaders had invited me to speak at the National Prayer Breakfast in 2012. My Bonhoeffer book came out in 2010. And in 2012, when President Obama was in office, I was invited. And so many years before, I had seen Garrison Keillor at the Boston Opera House in 1985, during the lean years when I was struggling and stumbling around. And Garrison Keillor, at the end of this evening, led 2,500 people at the Boston Opera House in singing Amazing Grace a cappella. And it was so moving, it was so transcendent, that it was like a religious experience to me, even though I was not walking with God consciously at that time. I was not, any kind of a Christian particularly, but I was so moved by it. And then many years later, I get invited to the Washington prayer breakfast, and President Obama's right here, and Vice President Biden's right here, and Nancy Pelosi's here, and right in front of me is Hillary Clinton, and I get to speak about Jesus and about Bonhoeffer and about Wilberforce. I mean, it was an amazing thing, and I got this crazy idea because the year before I spoke, Francis Collins spoke. He's the head of the National Institutes of Health, super genius scientist who's a Christian. He spoke the year before I did. And at the end of his talk, he pulled out a guitar and played a hymn. And I thought, you know what? That would be pretty wild if I led everybody, including President Obama, in singing Amazing Grace a cappella, because everybody knows the lyrics to Amazing Grace, or at least to the first verse. So I did that. And it was, I mean, people can watch it. If they go to my website, which is just my name, ericmetaxas.com, there's a video of the National Prayer Breakfast. And at the end of it, everybody sings Amazing Grace. So it was really moving for me. And I should really be clear, this book is utterly apolitical. I mean, there's just nothing political in the book. It's meant to be, just a portrait, of the artist as a young man, I guess, growing up and trying to make sense of life. And I say it's a search for the meaning of life, which I find at the end of it, around my 25th birthday, I come to faith rather miraculously. There's no way around it. But the book is not particularly theological, and it's it's utterly apolitical. It's just the story of me growing up. And I feel like I want people who are not on the same page as me politically or theologically to just read it because it's a good read, because it's funny, because it's well written, hopefully. There's some parts where it's very wistful. I want people to read it for that reason, because I don't think of it as a Christian book. I just think of it as a book of me in my young life. The very ending, I have this experience. But before that, it's just me as a young person trying to figure things out.
I get a couple of examples of you orientating to sound, and sometimes it was just sound that you orientated to. I remember you took to bed with you, or maybe it was your father, I guess, took to bed a bunch of cicadas.
Yes.
And you say there was a prehistoric racket for many days.
That's a story. My father's told me these stories my whole life. And I'm so thrilled that I was able to put them in this book. He talks about when he was 5 years old. So this would be 1932. He's in Mavrata, which is in Salonia, Greece, which of course I write about in the book. I write a lot about my Greek background and my Greek family. I write about my German background and my German family, and about those places, the villages in Germany, Großstubnitz and Mavrata in Kefalonia. And I write about my father living with his father. It was his mother. I don't know if they separated the parents, but my father at age 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 is living with his father alone in the village, whereas his mom and 2 older brothers are in the capital city, going to school there. And my father, they have siestas because it's so hot in the summer, where everybody goes to sleep in the middle of the day, and they stay up late and get up early. And while his father was sleeping, he snuck around and caught cicadas, which is really not easy to do. Maybe he was older than 5, maybe he was 7 or something, but he caught these cicadas and put them in a cigarette carton and then closed it after he caught a bunch of them, and he closed it and then fell asleep. And they got out while he was sleeping, and they went to every unknown corner of the house where they made this din for days and days on end, because they're incredibly loud. But look, that's just one. There's so many stories like that in the book, just crazy stories.
You called it Punishing Prehistoric Racket.
I'm glad you appreciate my writing. That means a lot to me, because, I think of myself as a literary writer, and this is really a literary memoir more than a spiritual memoir, for sure.
I hope everybody comes to enjoy this book. You also wrote a book on Bonhoeffer and a book on Wilberforce that called the nation to stand up for, and I think those 2 books undoubtedly led you to stand up for what you thought Trump was for. I'm really glad you could be with us. There is so much in this book. I hope that people get a little taste of it here, and go and read the book.